So, Andy and I were on a call earlier this week with one of our founders talking about any number of things, but really what are the main focuses for this year that this CEO is going to laser in on. And so we started talking about product and what he wants to do with product. And I was trying to understand what are like the forward-looking indicators for you that things are going well versus not well. And he basically said, I want to see mock-ups from my product team every day. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. Why is that what you want to see? He's like, because if I don't and I leave them for a week or I leave them for a month, all sorts of decisions are going to get made. And then I'm going to come in and be like, what the hell? Why do we make these decisions? Sure, maybe they get the job done, but none of the product team is using the product. And this guy thinks through the eyes of the customer that's using it. Um, which led me to later this week, walking up to the floor. We're doing a construction project in our house, and our contractor called me and said, oh, we have to do this like little change. And I was traveling and I said, all right, do we have to do it? He said, yeah. I was like, go for it. So I came home a day later and I saw the change. And all they were doing was adding 2 inches to basically like the rafters everywhere. But when you added 2 inches, it changed everything because we were already operating in a somewhat narrow space. And now all of a sudden, like the ceiling was going to come down 2 inches, which meant that the doors had to move over, or we were going to end up with doors that we thought were going to be 30 inches wide, and now they were going to be like 24 inches wide, like tiny doors. And this was happening, or we were going to have like uh trim around a door that just died into the sheetrock, which would look horrible. And so I went upstairs and I was talking to the guys who were just hammering nails, and they were just like, hey, we're just here to do the job, right? We're just doing what they told us to do. And I'm up there saying, yeah, but I'm looking at this place that I'm going to have to live in. And how did nobody notice that there was this like change? And why did the change have to happen? Well, it was because the installation guy came the day before and said, I need more space in the wall so that I can put more insulation into it so that you basically, like have more heat, but more importantly, pass code. But like there was another way to think about this problem. And so, anyway, the topic for today, which Charlie titled yesterday appropriately in my mind, was the loss of business context in product development. And it probably extends well beyond product development. But if I were to explain that through my own personal example, the business context was I have to live in this house, I have to live in this room, and yet the product team ran and made this decision without really thinking about what is it going to be like to live in this place. Rather, let's just get the job done. And it's hard to blame them, right? They were just doing their job. And we had this conversation earlier this week with one of our CEOs who was basically saying the same thing. If I don't walk the floor every day and see changes to the product, things will happen that are really bad decisions, and then we end up having to undo them. And you know what they had to undo in my roof? A day of work, because they had put all this stuff up and then they had to rip it back down. I will shut up. Curious your guys' thoughts. I know you have a lot on them. Charlie, maybe you start because you deal with this every day with your company.
Sure. So, like we talked about yesterday, this problem is the most frustrating thing I think I've spent the past 10 years of my life dealing with in any software product, of which I've worked on hundreds over the past 10 years. The biggest problem in building things that are good fast is the loss of context from the person with the idea to the person doing their work. And I think your story about your roof is a good example, or a story Andy told yesterday about a doctor. So, like, let's say I have something in my lung, so I get surgery, and maybe the doctor sees like a tumor on my heart, but he's a lung doctor, and he just fixes my lung and then sews me back up, and then a month later, my heart hurts, and so I go back, and the cardiologist says, "Oh, you have a tumor on your heart." I'm surprised the lung doctor didn't see that when he was operating on you. And you ask the lung doctor, "Well, what happened?" And he was like, "Oh, I just, I saw it." But it's like, "Well, did you think of saying something that might have been useful?" And I think this is the theme of all software projects. If I could like put like a poster above my bed, it would be like did you think of saying something about that? That seemed like it might have been important. But that requires everyone to have the same context of why it's important. And so that was kind of a winding narrative. But this is, I think, the biggest problem in software. And one of the reasons I'm enthusiastic about a lot of these new AI tools is because they should be helpful, I think, to help pull developers, designers, product managers, etc., out of the weeds to spend more time on understanding the business context that they're operating within and less time just like writing code in the weeds. So I'll stop that rant there, but it's biggest problem, bar
There's a,
none.
there's another way of thinking about that, this whole thing, and it's there's a saying: the flip side of every virtue is a vice, and I might describe this as the curse of specialization. We all want the specialists because they know the most about this thing, but if the specialist does not put it in a context of like this is really about the person's health, you know, it creates a problem. In my old business, I used to require that when I would interview people, I'd say, "Tell me what you read." And if they were not reading the New York Times or Wall Street Journal or stuff like that on a regular basis, I didn't care that they were reading research mags or rags. I said, "That's great. Why do you think the client is doing the work with us? They're not doing it just to hear what customers say. They need to take that and apply it to their business. So if you don't understand business or the context in which they operate, the value of what you're doing is going to be far less than it could be." So that to me is why every one of these functions, and we all want them to be super good, super specialized, the best at doing this thing, but we all have to force them somehow to sit and say, okay, so ultimately, what's the purpose of this? What does it serve? What's the greater good that you're doing this for? And if you can't do that, or you can't articulate it, or you don't have the instinct to want to understand that this is actually connected to the way the customer's going to be operating on the screen, then what you do, it's going to result in, in Will's case, hey, listen, we made the thing bigger. I don't care that you can't have a shower now. Well, just take a sponge bath in the sink.
Hey, Andy, I want to park your one question about force. How do you force this? But I am curious. So, like, we've heard Andy, you talk about this when you built a business, Charlie, in your current business. And I know we're talking a bit about product development, but Ram, I'm super curious because you have not been part of this conversation this week. What bell goes off in your head relative to kind of the go-to-market activities that you see and deal with?
Well, I think that I just want to start maybe more on the product side, and then we'll get to go to market in a second. I think when we think about building anything, it's like a never-ending curiosity. And when I hear things like missing context, it also triggers a flag in my brain that did you even ask the right questions to understand how your decision will impact the user or the buyer or the outcome you're trying to achieve, and where does that mindset come from, and where does that thinking come from? We had an old saying that if content is king, context is God. And
Mm.
I think the way it shows up the most, in my opinion, on the product side, which is what Charlie was alluding to, which is in design. Like if you can give product managers the opportunity to get the automated tasks done, like the code and all that stuff, you start thinking about designing the workflows, the interface in a way that actually drives the change you're looking for in users in a way that feels frictionless. That's where like how this shows up. If you look at Airbnb, it's probably the best evolution we've seen in a long time of how their constant research and context of both the supplier and the buyer in their journey need to work together to drive a transaction. And Shopify is doing a pretty good job there too. So I think the inspiration really B2C it shows up is something B2B companies can do more of. On the go-to-market side, fundamentally, there's two things I'd like to point to. In early stage businesses is how much is customer feedback being listened to and acted on versus how much it should be listened to or acted on. I'm not saying customers are always right, and I'm not saying product managers are always right, but there's some Venn diagram that exists between those two worlds where we could come together and say, you know what, we could be inspired. So why can't we build with our customers rather than for our customers? Is a mindset I think that needs to change on the and the number one feeding ground of that is the go to market side. There could be more information being fed from go to market to product to help product. And what I see a lot of in the best companies is that symbiotic relationship. In the worst companies, it's, well, product is not building this for me, so I can't sell. And so I think that's how these things manifest. Is this constant idea that we're all on team customer, and that team customer requires both product and go to market to constantly ask the right questions and figure out what to pay attention to and where to innovate in a way that they are magically surprised by the outcome.
Ram, you said a bunch of things, and maybe this is a good segue back to this question of forcing, and maybe the answer isn't forcing, but Andy said, like, how do you force that on the team or on the people? I wrote down, like, customer context is king, and the title of this is losing the business context. You talked about symbiotic relationship, that you see it in the best teams and it's not there in the worst. How do you actually, like, have we seen examples of actually trying to make this happen? And if so, like, what does that look like at, like, the ground level of, I mean, I know we talk a lot in TIA about customer feedback and, you know, the signal that you hear from customers, but, like, how do you actually make this happen in an organization?
Yeah, I think it starts the CEO with this mindset that that we are never comfortable, we are never right in the way we're approaching this. We're constantly refining and tuning in a way that actually is a step ahead of our customers. Why can't we be proactive in our development? And I think that's where context really shows up, is the company starts to be proactive, meaning that if they hear 2 or 3 things from a customer, they can leverage that to say, what's the impact of that? What's the so what? What's the so what? And now they're building with that context in mind, saying, here's how your first workflow is going to impact you. Here's how your second workflow is going to impact you. Here's how the third thing you use. So what it likely becomes is a CEO down mindset of that we are leveraging context to be proactive in the way we help our customers. I think how that manifests on the ground floor level, you know, candidly, is everybody asking that second order question in any meeting. That's how it shows up internally. Is like when a product manager doesn't understand, they don't assume, they ask. They don't have judgment in that ask. They actually ask. When a salesperson doesn't know what that customer means, they ask. They don't know if the salesperson doesn't know how that customer is actually hitting their goals with this technology, they ask. It's a constant second order, third order curiosity and fearlessness, where the genuine purpose is to learn, not to sell or not to build.
How does that flow from, like, we have a company in our portfolio, Rally, right? And Rally helps the orchestration of doing customer research, right? Because it's surprising to learn that it's actually really difficult for companies to talk to their own customers. It's actually a lot easier to go hire a third-party research firm to help you do that. And Rally launched this product called Observer Rooms, which is, you know, the premise of Rally is not only should the user research function have access or help give us insights from customers. I mean, Rally in its most successful form gives every product manager on the planet immediate access to a customer when they want them, so that they can ask them questions. And so they launched this product called Observer Rooms, which is, hey, I'm about to go talk to a customer. Anybody who wants to join me can listen in. It's like a focus group. You're behind the glass wall. And yet, like, I don't know, it's doing well, but you don't have the whole company joining those observer rooms. And if you're saying some of this flows from the top, maybe Charlie, like, I've seen some of the internal memos you write to your company to try to just pound this into everyone's head. How do you actually, if it flows from the top, and we all know that we should be asking second order questions, but we're not, only the biggest firms on the planet are doing this level, doing the kind of research that Andy built his career on. How do you actually get this to happen?
I think this is like one of the hardest questions for any organization. In my view, I don't want to say it's cynical, but I guess what I'm about to say is kind of cynical, is that like it's just like why can't anyone be a founder? Like we talk to lots of different people. We watch people start companies. Sometimes we invest in founders who aren't as good and we watch what they can't do. And they don't have the capacity as strong of a capacity to understand things from different information sources. Like their cross interdisciplinary skills just aren't as good. Maybe they may be awesome at one thing, and that's great, but they're not awesome at synthesizing information. Some people are just better at this than others. That doesn't mean that other people can't improve, but as someone who's hired, let's say, a couple hundred engineers, like my cynical view is like the biggest thing you can do right is hire people who innately, through their own personal development up to that moment or for whatever reason they were blessed with, innately think about the world from this point of view. Like, oh, I'm building this, why am I doing this? That's just something that some people have more than others, I think. And if you're trying to teach people who don't think that way and like systematically get them to that place, I think you're just gonna like lose your mind because you're gonna run into a brick wall. And I think this becomes even doubly more complicated now that we have global teams. Let me give like a really silly example anecdote, and I think this will illustrate this. So I work with a lot of people in Eastern Europe, and they are from post-Soviet countries. And I asked a colleague who lived in America, who now has lived in America from Ukraine for like 8 years. I was like, why do developers not seem to understand always that there's a lot of competition for our services? There are other people who can offer to do the same thing as us. Maybe we do it better, but like ideally they'd understand this is really competitive. You can't just tell a client like you'll accept it this way because that's how we're going to do it and you don't have another choice. And the story he told me was like, you know, towards the early 2000s, mid 2000s, when iPhones were just coming out in the US, you could go to an iPhone store and you could just buy one. So like there was unlimited supply, and so there was competition for the buyer between Apple, between Samsung, Ericsson, etc., whoever. So like you had to put your best foot forward. In some of these post-Soviet places, there was no Apple store. So if you wanted an iPhone, the guy who has them, who smuggled them in or imports them, he has all the leverage. So the seller had all the leverage, and if you want one, you need to be nice to him, and he can kind of charge you however much you want. So it was like a totally inverted market environment. And then if you say to that person, okay, now you're going to work with an American company, there's two hurdles they need to overcome. A, they need to develop this interdisciplinary muscle to, you know, synthesize content from context from different places, like if they're a developer. And then two, they need to understand a totally different environment that just might not make sense to them. And so this is why I say it's like really hard to just systematically take people and like sculpt them like a piece of clay into this team member.
And yet you've built a very successful business with, I know, many engineers who do have the context. Are you saying you've just selected very well, or have you as a leader also done things to push them to be more context driven?
I think I wish I could take a lot of credit. I think there's a list of people in my company, and I have their names in my head who I'm like, I want to work with this person. They're awesome. Just like why you want to work with your HVAC guy, because you know he's got it. He understands what you want. You don't need to like lay it out for him. Not everyone we work with is like that. In bigger teams, like you're not going to bat 100%, but as long as you can sort of have the leadership who's able to do this, historically that's been like really valuable. Like the more you can get that to proliferate down, the better. I wouldn't say like I've knocked this out of the park. I would say I've lost a lot of hair thinking about this problem. And I think it's just like persistence, and over time you try to solve this incrementally and get meet people where they are and try to help them as best you can to like sort of, yeah, I think you want to like incentivize them or explain to them, hey, if you want to have a more successful career, if you want to make more money, you want to be more valuable, like this is what the person you're working with cares about. And it might be a little different than what you thought originally. Like they don't care about you completing tickets. They care about you understanding what they want and getting it done as fast as possible. So making this line the shortest, not
You just talked about incentive. Like, should we be putting incentives in certain places? Andy, sorry, I don't want to go for
No,
it,
no,
but like,
I was just going to say Charlie talking about hair loss sounded like a cue for me, but I just and I do want to get to incentives in a minute. What this conversation makes me think about. Certainly we talked about if the CEO or the founder doesn't have that context and curiosity, it's almost inconceivable that the company will operate that way. So, we used to say in the same way you can't teach somebody a sense of humor, you can't teach them to be curious, but you can operationalize these things into the way you do business. So, example of this is, when I used to train people to be focus group moderators, and, they'd ask a question and they'd get an answer, and then they'd start moving on. And I would say, so stop right there. So if the client comes to you right now and says, so why did they buy the car? And you just heard them say, well, it was new. I love trying new things. At that point, you could go and the client goes, yeah, but there's 5 billion new products every year. They don't try them all. So why did they try this? So operationalizing it and sort of operationalizing sort of the context question can be done. And for example, the implementing, why are we building this? Why does the customer care? And knowing that every person at the company, the boss can walk in and ask them this question, they have to be ready to answer it, and they know that's part of their job. It used to be there's ample stories around whether it's Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, where they knew that if they walked in a meeting with him, they were going to have to answer a certain species of question, and they would not enter that room without being able to answer it.
Andy,
So,
I love that. Two thoughts on that, because like I'm going back to the founder that you and I were talking a bit earlier in the week, and I think part of what our discussion with him was like, hey, everybody should operate under the assumption that any given time he may be walking the floor asking you, why are we doing this? And then you also made me think about a company that you did a lot of work with recently, because they reached out saying, hey, we want to do some customer diligence, and they had built this product, and I think you were maybe observing them ask questions and or telling them about how to think about asking questions, and they probably would have stopped at the first question if not for you pushing them. And what it led to was this like insight that to them was like, this, how can this be? Like, this seems so simple. I didn't, because they were asking the customer, do you like this? And they were showing them something, and the customer was like, oh, I really like that thing. And that thing to them, it was literally showing them how much money is in their bank account. Like, I'm not joking. This is actually,
yeah.
and the company was like, wait, can't you just log into your own bank account to see that? And the customer was like, yeah, I could, but like, it's a lot easier if it's just here all in one place. And they were like, what? Anyway, like, they wouldn't have learned that. Instead, they would have just heard, oh, we like it. It's interesting.
Well, that just to jump in for one more second, because I know Ram has something to say. Wills, you're notorious for always pushing these guys to build an ROI calculator that's right in front of their face. So they cannot escape the actual, whoever's using the platform, the actual value that it's providing. Don't ask the customer to have to do extra work to discern the value. So it's not a perfect analog, but it's one of those things where if you're building the product and you think, well, why are they actually doing this? They're doing it because ultimately they either want to save time, they want to save money, etc. And if you can reinforce what it is, the value that the product's actually providing, it'll be stickier, it'll be more viral. But if you don't sit and appreciate why they're actually doing it,
Yeah, and the key part about ROI calculators is actually the inputs and agreeing with your customer on the inputs, which requires you to have context on the business and knowing what inputs they're using to drive the outputs. I think to comment on incentives, this is like a big deal inside small businesses, which is like, how do you reward your staff? And cash isn't always an option to do that, especially at seed stage or even Series A. And what I found is when you reward your teammates for asking those second order questions or asking that third, being going deeper in a meeting publicly in front of everybody else, you set the tone. When you promote people, and one of the reasons why you communicate why you promoted them is because they always were willing to go deeper and ask that question. You can signal that way. So I think this is what, like, and if you think about like the strongest leaders, it's the ones that are always constantly asking questions of the entire decision around them and knowing how they connect versus those who are willing to make the speed decision to get to the fastest way of hitting that goal.
Hmm.
The ones that know how to get the speed and quality is because they know what questions to ask and know how to ask that question. I think you can teach that, and I think it's been really hard. I'm not going to blame COVID for everything. It's been really hard for younger staff members to experience this by osmosis in the office. But what you can do is do it through the Zoom calls or virtual meetings where you reward that behavior, and I think that can go a long way. I've seen it live when people ask, "That's a really good question." You could see the room change, and that person feel a sense of warmth. Those are really simple tactics for every CEO of a 15, 20 person company to do and set the tone daily.
I love it. Just if I could recap again, the title here was The Loss of Business Context in Product Development. Just let's go down the row here. Ram, then Andy, Charlie. Final thoughts on this. Ram.
Uh, Stay curious, communicate more together, and in a world of data abundance, ask the second and third order question.
Andy.
I put an exclamation point after Ram's second or third order. The three-letter word why why is that important? Those were more than three letters, is key. Another thought is operationalize context. It can be done. And the final thought is don't invest in a founder who's not inherently and relentlessly curious.
Charlie.
Okay, well, I have to say something different than you two guys. So, my final thought would be the old way of building software products looked kind of like a line. There's the person with the idea, and then there's the product manager, let's say, and then the context goes to developers and designers and QA people, and then it goes in this big loop. And so it's a line, it's a slow line with context loss. Instead of thinking about it as a kind of like a linear communication, imagine a circle where the person with the idea or the original thought is in the middle and everyone is communicating and collaborating directly. So there's no context loss across people because what happens is this game of telephone, it's like a kindergarten class, and that the message gets just as silly as it would with 5-year-olds. So circles, not lines. And I agree with Andy about curiosity. I think that's really the most intrinsic thing related to this.
Wills?
I'll add my
Yeah.
own. I'll ask my own of myself. And I think this is something I've kind of tuned into more and as I get a little bit older. Sometimes you may just have to be a real jerk and just take the matter into your own hands and trust a bit of your gut and walk the floor and be the tastemaker, because you also have to trust, but that requires you also being very customer facing. Like you may be the person who's listening the most because you're talking to your customer constantly, or you may be the person who has to live in this on this floor or in this bedroom. And so then it's really not that difficult for you to figure it out. But sometimes you just have to be a jerk and just be the tastemaker and be the person walking around asking that question why, or getting the daily mock-ups because everyone is afraid of disappointing. So
Can I throw in one more thought?
one more.
I used to tell the people who worked for me, I said, listen, our customers are not buying marketing research because they want marketing research. They're buying it because they have business problems or objectives they've got to address. None of our portfolio company customers are buying software because they want software. They're buying software to solve a problem or, attain an objective. And if you don't appreciate the problem or the objective or the goal, you're going to do a far worse job of everything from building to selling to creating a good business than you would if you appreciate the context.